now that we understand interest rates, both nominal and real interest rates, ultimately that we care about the real interest rate when making decisions, we're finally in a position to start developing a model of the credit market. So we're going to start with demand for credit. So learning objective 2 here is to understand determinants of credit demand and what shifts that credit demand curve. So again, the real interest rate, that's what we care about as decision makers. So as the real interest rate increases, what do you expect will happen to the quantity of credit demanded? Well, as the real interest rate increases, that's more pizza I'm going to have to give up in interest as a result of paying the loan on my car. So as the real interest rate goes up, the quantity of credit demanded is going to go down. Quantity of credit demanded goes down. That makes sense. The more I have to give up in future consumption to get something today, the less I'm going to be willing to do that. I'm only willing to give up so much future consumption to get that car today. As the real interest rate goes up, I want to buy fewer cars. I want to borrow less money overall. And so what we're going to see is like a pretty typical demand curve. So I'm going to put the quantity of credit on the horizontal axis and the real interest rate R on the vertical axis. And the credit demand curve, given this intuition, should be a downward sloping curve. That's credit demand. As the interest rate goes up, the quantity of credit that I'm demanding is decreasing. All right, that makes pretty good sense. Pretty standard demand curve. The interest rate is the price of the good I'm buying, credit in this case. Now, what determines how steep that curve is how sensitive we are to changes in that real interest rate. Sensitivity to real interest rate. So I'll draw 2 different examples here. So I'm just going to call this Q, quantity of credit, and R, the real interest rate. So I'll kind of draw 2 extreme examples. So here's credit demand 1, and another option, quantity of credit and the real interest rate, is it's much flatter. Call that credit demand 2. So what we see here is in credit demand 1, we're much less sensitive to changes in the real interest rate. And what we mean by that is the quantity of credit demanded doesn't change much as the real interest rate changes. So notice I could have, say, a real interest rate of 20%, and let's say I demand $20,000 in credit. And if that real interest rate goes way down to, let's say, 1%, there hasn't been a huge change in the quantity of credit demanded. So maybe we're up to 21,000. So when the curve is very steep, we're not sensitive. So if you've had principles of micro, we're not really focusing on this term too much, but that's called inelastic demand. Meaning it's not very elastic, it's not very sensitive to changes in the real interest rate. So a steep curve means we're not sensitive. The flatter curve over here is the opposite. We're very sensitive. So here, a small change in the interest rate. So let's say we go from a 5% interest rate and we want $20,000 in credit to a 4% interest rate. Notice we go much further along the horizontal axis. So a 1% decrease there, a 1 percentage point decrease in my interest rate. All of a sudden I want a bunch more credit. We'll say $35,000. So when the curve is flat, I'm not very sensitive to the interest. I am very sensitive to the interest rate, and that causes a big change in the quantity of credit demanded. So flat, we are sensitive. And we call that elastic. Now, don't worry too much about the terms inelastic and elastic. I won't hit you too much on those. This is just to get some idea of different types of credit demand curves, and whether we're very sensitive or not sensitive is going to affect how different events in the economy impact the real interest rate in equilibrium. So our next order of business here is going to be to understand what is going to shift that credit demand curve to the left and to the right.